Good morning, everyone. I'm Alyse Nelson, President and CEO of Vital Voices. I'm going to be moderating this next discussion around climate finance, the gaps and opportunities around the new collective qualified goal on climate finance, NCQG. We're going to be looking to a number of experts. You can see them up on the screen, and actually we have even one more joining us. This is to be adopted at COP29 in Azerbaijan. And let me just quickly introduce the experts who are going to be weighing in. So first, Jean Baderschneider, Board of Directors of Fortescue Metals and Future Industries, board member of the McCain Institute and part of the advisory board for COP29.
And a big supporter of Vital Voices.
Thank you. Hindou Ibrahim. Hindou Ibrahim is newly elected as the chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She is also part of the advisory board for COP29. Edda Aradottir, who is an incredible social entrepreneur, one of our We Empower Global Challenge awardees. She is CEO of Carbfix, based in Iceland. Cekuta. Robert Cekuta is a former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan. Let's see. Oh, I want to make sure I pronounce your first name right. Aurelien Boyer is Global Manager of Climate Finance and Policy at the IFC. We will also be joined by Hiro Mizuno, who is MSCI Special Advisor and former UN Special Envoy on the Sustainable Finance from Japan. And finally, Patricia Espinosa, who is the former Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, and she held that role from 2016 to 2022. So Patricia, I want to start off with you. If you could give us a sense of the current situation, but also the real realities and challenges.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alyse, and let me also join my voice to thank the Azeri presidency for bringing us all together, people from such different backgrounds, people with an incredible amount of experience in many, many fields. It's really an honor, a privilege to be able to be here with all of you. Regarding this issue about the new collective quantified goal on finance for the climate efforts, for climate action. Just 2 words of introduction. One of them is that this is a decision that was taken within the Paris Agreement, that in 2025, the international community should come together and define a new goal on finance for the efforts of developing countries in order to make the transition that is necessary towards a more sustainable world. And this was established then because previously, since 2010 actually, in Cancun, in the conference of the parties that I had the honor to preside over, the decision was taken that 100 billion would be mobilized every year as of 2020 in order to support these efforts of climate action in developing countries. And why is that? Because one of the bases of this international regime, the climate regime, is the fact that there are there is a very clear distinction between those countries, developed countries, that had the opportunity, the possibility to develop without any restriction in the use of resources, and the countries that now are feeling the effects of climate change in greatly produced by the greenhouse gas emissions that these industrialization processes brought, and therefore need to be supported in order to be able to make the changes that will be important not only for them, but for the planet as a whole, because as we know, the atmosphere doesn't recognize any kind of borders. So let me say, with this general framework, you can only imagine, all of you, with the broad experience that you have, how difficult and how controversial it is. How much is it? The initial figure of 100 billion, to be very honest, was put on the table a bit just thinking, well, you know, we need to put something that sounds like it's going to be helpful, but there was not an estimation made behind it. Now, currently, we have estimations. We know that this transition towards more sustainable modes of operating in our society will need an incredible amount of resources, and that goes to the trillions. There you can see different calculations, but we're talking about not anymore 100 or 200 million, but we are talking about trillions. So at the same time, I think it is very important that we acknowledge that, of course, we cannot expect that there will be trillions from public money coming into the financing the transition in developing countries. So that just gives you an idea of the complexity of this negotiation. Yes, there is an obligation clearly established in the Paris Agreement, in the climate change regime for developed countries to support the efforts of developing countries. The amount of finance that has been coming forward is very small, nothing close to where we need to go. And at the same time, what we are seeing is also global warming is accelerating at a rate that is much higher than was previously estimated by the science. We are now on track to more or less, if there is really no really very, very transformative actions taken, we are on track for a global warming of twice the 1.5 degree goal that has been established according to science. And 1.5 degrees, which is the goal that has been accepted, is not a goal to bring back the planet to where it was in the pre-industrial time. It is only to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. So just we need to be very, very conscious that already today there are damages that are not possible to be reversed. So I have dedicated a lot of my professional career to this, so I can only tell you that, yes, many people ask, is it going to be possible? I just believe that we, decision makers or people that can have some kind of influence, cannot avoid the responsibility of at least trying. And I would say that every time that humanity has tried, humanity has been able to overcome the most incredible challenges. Take the examples of so many diseases like polio, eradication of polio. Take the example of the ozone layer that, that was something that I remember reading about that while I was very young, and I thought, no, that's going to be impossible. How are we going to solve the problem of the ozone layer? Well, it was done. So I do believe that this can be done. Yes, it needs a lot of effort. It needs a lot of creativity in terms of how we can use public money to, yes, in many cases, give grants, but in other cases, to use that public money to leverage and de-risk investments in many countries around the world, and to make this transition sustainable and profitable as well. Thank you very much, Alyse.
Thank you. Aurelien, I want to bring you into this discussion because we know certainly that mobilizing private capital is key, but how do we ensure buy-in from key stakeholders, especially if they weren't party to the NCQG?
Yeah, that's a key question. I think as the president, incoming president of the COP29 reminded us yesterday, we need solidarity, but when you see the magnitude of the problem, solidarity will not be enough. We need private capital, and to drive private capital to the emerging markets, you need more than good sentiment. So it would be a critical challenge, and in terms of driving that money from the private capital, from the private sector, yes, you need to drive it to climate finance, but you need to first address what are the barriers to investing in the emerging markets, and then to drive this into climate projects. So, like different layers and solutions. So in the NCQG, I think it will be, as I said, it's a challenge that the bulk of the money has to come from stakeholders, actors who are not part of the official parties under the UNFCCC process and are not part of the negotiation. So you need to have a process. I think the president-designate yesterday said like it needs to be inclusive, there needs to be the consultation, and I think that's the preamble leading to what will be in the text. But then the text of the NCQG very concretely needs to recognize certain principles. It needs to recognize that the public money, as we say, need to also be used to leverage the private sector through different mechanisms that already exist. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You have what we call blended finance. For instance, that IFC, for every dollar of blended finance that we use to invest in emerging market, we mobilize 8 times, and we mobilize we can mobilize 8 times. So for the same dollar that goes into a project, you can mobilize 8 times more to get into the investment. You have guarantee products that can be used against that leads to a good leverage ratio, and this needs to be done. So you need to really acknowledge that all the money that will go to in the public money in the NCQG should not go just as compensation, loss and damages, and the typical public funding of projects. You need to recognize that this will require public-private partnerships and blended public money with private money, which is something that can be politically challenging, but is key. The other principle that is important is try to create, in my opinion, in the NCQG, some interlinkages with other processes and initiatives that are ongoing, maybe the MDB reforms and the reform of the financial architecture in the G20. So how to create linkages so that you can, it's not just a separate COP process, but some of the architecture that is needed to mobilize the private capital to the emerging market, especially for climate, can be fully used. So that will be a call on MDB and other development institutions, but it's also a responsibility, I think, a call on government to move ahead with the necessary reform, either for the general enabling environment to get to emerging market, but also in terms of making sure you channel those funds to climate projects. So how to incentivize and support government to have a carbon tax, how to support government to send a signal through reform of fossil fuel subsidies that you are serious about climate, and in the end, that would be conducive to private sector investment. And the last point I'd like to make, it's fully in the hands and connecting to the Paris Agreement. I think right now when we see the discussion on the NCQGs, there is a bit of a disconnect with other mechanisms that are contemplated under the Paris Agreement. maybe the NDCs, the National Adaptation Plan, the long-term strategy, or Article 6, which is for operationalizing carbon credit as a tool to mobilize private finance into climate projects in the South. I think creating those interlinkages, for instance, having in the NDCs and in the NAPs clear project pipelines, incentivizing governments to come up with project pipelines that will be bankable and financeable is key, because it's one thing to have the money. I can guarantee we can all agree that about the order of magnitude, and when we say like now it's in the trillion, these are financing needs. If magically we put that money on the table tomorrow, it will not be deployed because you don't have the project. So you need to work on the project, and through some of the instruments already contemplated under the Paris Agreement, you can put more emphasis on getting a more bankable project. And again, I know a lot of people are scared currently under the carbon markets, and it's not something that is being prioritized, but reconnecting carbon markets to the broader agenda of climate finance and see what progress can be made through carbon markets would be key to mobilize. So.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Building on that, Jean, I wonder if you could talk about how do we incentivize the private sector, but also thinking about how you have been a lifelong advocate for human rights and the advancement of women. We know that so little financing goes towards women-led climate solutions. So would first love for you to address how do we incentivize the private sector, but then specifically thinking about making the case for investing in women-led climate solutions.
So good morning, everyone. Thanks, Alyse. I'm going to build on my prior two colleagues because I have some comments similar, but want to build on those and create a framework to come back to your last question. This is such a critical discussion right now, and I think everybody in this room understands that we have a real risk of seeing a twin-track energy transition. And we all know that a twin-track energy transition will be a failed energy transition for sure. So I want to talk about the challenge, then I'm going to talk about possible solutions and a policy twist, and I'm going to build on a couple of my the prior colleagues' comments. First of all, in terms of the challenge, sometimes statistics help us understand better than words. According to the IEA, for example, Africa is home to 60% of the world's best solar resources, yet only 1% of installed solar PV capacity. 60% versus 1%. Meanwhile, about 600 million people on the continent live without reliable electricity. So the issue is not natural potential or a lack of projects and opportunities or need. It's about our ability to finance projects, very specific projects that could create real assets in circumstances where the cost of capital for even a low-risk established technology like solar PV is on average at least twice as high as emerging economies in the OECD. I have seen this in my work with the Kenya government to establish a domestic green fertilizer market and industry. They want renewable energy to do this, but it's going to cost us twice as much to do it there. That is and it starts with this competitive disadvantage. So, solutions, turning to the solutions, let me bring the perspective of the private investor, Fortescue, and having grown up in the oil and gas sector and in the finance sector, there has to be a commitment to develop a portfolio of green projects. My fundamental view is that we can only succeed in financing both the energy transition and climate mitigation and adaptation in developing economies. If we unlock private capital at scale, we can do that. And my next comment relates to yours, that it requires collaboration between governments, multilaterals, investments, and businesses, and there have to be workable PPPs that include the civic space as well. And in order to do that, we have to do three things. We've got to reduce the cost of large-scale green projects. Power is a critical issue that's not allowing any of this to go forward. We need to increase the demand for green products. The single biggest, scarcest resource in the world right now is a long-term offtake agreement because it doesn't allow the private sector to monetize. And third, increasing project returns. It's the only way we do this. So, a few recommendations and a couple of comments about policy moving forward. To unlock private financing in emerging markets, just a couple of things. Clearly, there's a critical role for concessional financing. There has to be. With higher loan advance rates and lower interest rates, we can de-risk projects and make them more attractive to investors. This is why the NCQG negotiations are so important. And it's also why I'm a little worried about what's happening with the CFAF, which is the other fund that's out there, which is the Climate Finance Action Fund, and what we're going to do there. Multilaterals also have a unique opportunity to help diversify the risk. For example, we could look like creating pooling financial vehicles across more than one project or market, tranching and securitizing them by loss ranking, and then developing insurance products for the more difficult to place tranches. Offtake support, there absolutely has to be offtake, either government or the global north taking offtake from global south. Upfront CapEx support, direct, we see some of that for large-scale infrastructure projects can also be a powerful intervention. Other interventions, our EPC contracts, for example, are often, and I'm involved in this right now, unwilling to wrap or insure new developments, such as green hydrogen, and we have to solve that. Finally, debt forgiveness. We're going to have to deal with debt forgiveness, and then I just can't not address the elephant in the room, which my colleague raised earlier, which is we all know that this is made so much harder due to an inability to put a proper price on carbon. Everyone will be familiar with the IMF analysis that shows that there are, guess how many, what the amount of subsidies to oil and gas? 7 trillion, yes, bingo, 7 trillion globally, annually. Imagine the environment if we converted that to public monies and to incentivize the development of green projects. And again, the precedents already exist. We are a recipient, a company that I am on a board of 200 million euros in CapEx granted from the EU Innovation Fund for a green ammonia project in Norway. And that Innovation Fund is financed through receipts from the EU's emission trading scheme, which means polluters are funding our green ammonia project. We have to do more of that. That's the intent. I was talking to Yelchin last night about this, a chief negotiator. That's the intent of the CFAF. But it's voluntary it's to go after emitters in the world. And so, hello, we got to figure out how to make that happen, and we have to incentivize it. So I'll stop here, and I'll come back to your other question about women in this space. I will just say that I had an opportunity to speak up at the Bloomberg Philanthropies earlier this week at the Industrial Transition Accelerator, and they are working on clear policies to accelerate this, and we are participating in that. We're providing input into the policy playbook. If anybody in this room has some policies they'd like to see part of that, let me know. We've already put in there regulated demands such as ring-fenced mandates, policies to address green premiums, carbon pricing, and government guarantees for offtake. So, look, every time I sit on one of these panels, we're lucky to have another woman on it, right? And in fact, COP29 has done a great job of resolving an issue that started up front when they had no women, right? But when they looked to do a finance workshop in October, they were hard-pressed to find women. And we have to do better. There are women. I work with financial geniuses who are women. We need to draw them in, and it's a personal goal of mine to make sure that every time we do one of these, we have women associated with us. Because when we have that kind of diversity of thought, and diversity of approach, and diversity of background, we get better solutions. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Edda, I want to bring you into this because you're such an important voice. You started a company to create a solution and obviously faced a lot of obstacles. Talk about your company, but also the challenges that you faced with financing.
Thank you, Alyse. Happy to address those 2 points. Yes, I lead an Icelandic climate tech company called Carbfix that is developing and scaling technical solutions that speed up the natural process of turning CO2 into stone. And we are also a recipient of the EU Innovation Fund. They are backing one of our largest projects that will take our technology to the megaton scale. But not many are actually aware that over 99.9% of all carbon that exists on Earth is already stored in the rocks beneath our feet. We tend not to think about that. And the fact that the transformation of carbon to minerals is actually part of the global carbon cycle. So what we do is we tap into this magnificent approach that nature has developed and used for millions of years. And we capture and receive CO2, we dissolve it in water, basically creates sparkling water. And this sparkling water we inject deep into the ground, into favorable geologic formations. And there, in 2 years, the CO2 mineralizes, turns to stone, becomes part of the bedrock forever. And after that, we can reclaim the water and use it again. Our technology is scalable across the globe. The formations that we target, they are some of the most abundant rock types on Earth. Theoretically, we could store orders of magnitude more than ever needed for climate action. Not saying that this is the magic fix to climate, definitely not. We all know that we need to scale multiple solutions simultaneously, but this is part of the solution space. And these types of technologies, they have to be scaled by at least a factor of 100 by mid-century, along with others, if we are to meet our climate targets. We have an expansion pipeline of projects that we want to implement as quickly as possible, including in the developing countries. But we are facing some barriers, like all climate companies, I assume. And some of the most critical barriers, they relate to policy, but also funding. And in my opinion, there exists a certain sort of disconnect between these two, policy and funding, and actual project implementation. And for policy in particular, demand for perfect has somehow become the enemy of the good, and we have to get away from that. And then on your question about the gap in funding for women-led initiatives and opportunities that lie in providing more funding for such initiatives, it is of course heartbreaking that women-led businesses receive disproportionately small percentage of private sector funding. Last year, women-founded startups received less than 2% of venture capital funding in both the US and Europe, as has already been shared here. And the numbers are even lower for emerging markets. Even in my country, the same applies. We don't have larger numbers than 2% of funding going into women-led businesses, and Iceland prides itself of being the global leader in gender equality, but we're not doing any better on this matter. And this gap, it reflects a systemic barrier, whether that is a conscious or unconscious barrier. I won't be the judge of that, in investment processes and decisions. But data, of course, shows, as I'm sure we are all aware, that despite receiving less funding, women-led businesses, they often outperform male counterpart-led businesses, both in terms of return on investment and job creation. We also tend to prioritize social, environmental goals. And this increases the impact of investing in women-led businesses. So it is a huge opportunity to close this gap. Should be an easy decision. It is good business to invest in women-led businesses. My experience, my female colleagues' experience shows that when it comes to funding processes, investment processes, potential investors, they tend to rather, in the case of women-led businesses, focus on risks. What can possibly go wrong? But when dealing with male-led investment opportunities, rather focus on which potential upside is in this investment. And this is an example of a serious bias that we are facing and has to be changed. So to conclude, it's good business to invest in women-led initiatives, and we must close this existing funding gap. And I truly hope that the next COP and mechanisms around climate funding will bridge this existing gap. And I want to conclude by suggesting, again, adding on the previous comments made, that when it comes to subsidizing fossil fuels, why do we not take the opportunity to divert some of those funds to women-led initiatives for climate? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Edda. You talked about the dismal numbers in terms of investing in women-led climate solutions. I want to turn now to Hindou, who is a leader who works with Indigenous communities, particularly Indigenous women leaders, who, as we know, are critical to creating climate solutions, who have been driving these solutions for decades, if not more. Talk a little bit about financial and non-financial support that needs to be provided from government, but also the international community to Indigenous leaders, but also particularly Indigenous women leaders, and what accountability mechanisms, from your perspective, need to be put into place.
Thank you, Alyse, and good morning, everyone. I think when we talk about climate finance, we really need to move from pledge, commitment, to real money that can serve the peoples, because we are talking about the impact. I come from Chad just last week. We have, over the last months of rain, 2 million people of displaced. To the previous discussion, are you calling them refugee? Are you calling them displaced? Are you calling them migrant in their internal countries? 2 months of heavy rain, 2 million people lost their home. 1,000 dead, some disappear. Land of hectares that disappear. What are we going to call those peoples? What are we going to respond to them? Is it the 100 billions that we just talking about it, going to those communities? So we really need to move from the talk of climate finance, from the pledge, how many billions, to the real cash in the tables to those peoples. When I just saw my people home, I'm like, where is the loss and damage fund that they're talking about? The board member of the loss and damage that they are arguing, who will be in the board, where are we going to set up the secretariat? How are we going to do that? I just to say, like, it's so ephemeral to discuss about just individual needs without talking about the real problem. Like, my people home need this loss and damage funding now. They need to adapt now. They cannot wait for later. So this is really my first point, to move from the pledge, to move from the talk, and really the complexity of how it's worked, to the real cash on the tables, to pay back those peoples. And in order to do that, we need the responsibility of the developed countries to be shown. They have to respect their wording, their commitment. Otherwise, no one will trust you anymore. We are going to COP29. Is that going to be another discussion on the NCQG? Are we again going to argue about full stop and comma and must or word or whatever into the NCQG to do not adopt it? Or are we really going to reform the finance of the climate change to serve the communities, to serve the women who are home, to serve the indigenous women, to serve the youth, to serve those who are impacted? So I really hope that the developed countries must take the responsibility and move the discussion on the negotiation of the NCQG to not be arguing about this country or that country or geopolitics who can block, and then our people become a threat of another negotiations. Second, how we can do that? We need transparency and accountabilities. The negotiation needs to be open and inclusive. We cannot let the peoples outside and just to discuss internally about this important life of the peoples. If I go to the COP, I'm representing millions of indigenous peoples, indigenous women. So if I do not be in the tables to hear or to contribute, why am I going there? I'm not going for tourism. Or otherwise I can choose summer to do not go in a winter that I cannot go out. So we need the inclusions of the peoples in the tables during these negotiations, and this is part of the accountability and transparency. You said very well, my dear Jen, about all the subsidy. You also said, Aurelien, subsidizing fossil fuel is much easier. And this is the responsibility of the private sector, of the bankers who are putting those money in the wrong places. They have to stop that. Great. They have to put the money in the right place. The money that we need to go to our communities is less than the subsidy that we are investing on it. And this is need to be inside the text of the negotiation of the NCQG to transform the subsidy money to the real project on the ground for the communities. And in terms of this transparency and accountability, we need the safeguard. The principles of the safeguard must be into the negotiation document. The safeguard for the right of communities, the safeguard on the justice, the safeguard on the equity. And this need the clear criteria. Why the 100 billions that like my country didn't get on it? The criteria that you put on it for a country just like to write a proposal and to go and to get access to the money, the time that they do the report of thousands of pages. No one have this expertise or time. We are not all going to turn to become a bankers. We are a project implementers, and people have another issues. So the criteria need to be flexible for developing countries. It needs to be flexible for the indigenous woman who didn't went to school, but who is really working on that. We need also to see how we are reforming all the finance. We are talking about global finance reform. Yes, it is important. The GCF needs to reform. The World Bank needs to reform. The IMF needs to reform. But it's not only the reform. It's not only debt pardon. No, it's not a pardon. The debt is the issue of responsibility. So the debt that all the developing countries contact, where the money come from, it's come from nature. Those who give this money come from nature. It is paying back the responsibility. So it is not debt, pardon, the debt is swap from what they take to invest on the climate action on the ground. And this language have to be clear. The debt is swap have to be serving the indigenous woman, the indigenous man, the general woman in the rural area, they use to go take that money to the projects, not to just turn the debt swap to, again, another infrastructure who is going to destroy the world. And of course, in my final word, we need at the COP to make clear how the accessibility of the funding to be. In order to do so, we need into the negotiation text to mention clearly a direct access finance. So we need to create a window of a clear amount of the money for indigenous peoples, a clear amount of money for women, a clear amount of money for youth. If you put all of us in the same pocket, again, it's going to repeat the same thing. The money will go to the bigger organization. The accessibility becomes very difficult. And then we will get in a peanut. And at the end of the day, we say like, oh, we include women. Oh, we include indigenous peoples. And this is not going to work. We need a clear language. You are all representing countries. You are all have been a head of state, head of government. So you know how to negotiate. And you can give these messages to your ministers, to your negotiators, to make it clear into the NCQG negotiations, to make all those principles I named that to you. And I'm going to give this document as my part of advisory to the presidency of the COP29, to Maria, who is chairing us, to Jen, who is facilitating. I will give you this clear proposition. And that's what I wanted to see into these documents. I wanted response to my peoples. I wanted the cash in the tables. We stop talking and we act. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindou. And we are incredibly blessed to have you in such a leadership role at COP29, so thank you. I want to bring in you, Robert, to talk about some of the work that you've been doing. I know you're now a professor writing and teaching about the issues, particularly of climate justice. But how do we get government to play a stronger role based on your experience having served in government?
Thank you very much. And I'm going to basically talk more or less from the perspective of someone who spent way too long in the government. I won't list the number of decades. But I think what we're going into with the COP is, as far as we were thinking about how we're briefing the USG right now, what the USG would be thinking about, there are really two tasks. One is securing the funds needed to have a variety of sources, pull funds from a variety of sources to decarbonize and to fight climate change. That's the basic goal. At the same time, and this is going to sound awkward coming after Hindou's intervention, there is a suspicion in some governments in some places that this is just a sort of rehash of earlier discussions about moving money from the global north to the global south. And I have to say this in all honesty and sort of bringing in the elephants that are running around the room here. We got an election coming up in the United States with two very, very different views of how things will proceed. There will be one president at the time of the COP, and that's Joe Biden. But what happens January 20th? Leaving it there. But I want to sort of pick up on this point of what I just said, and that is the governments cannot provide all the funds needed to fight climate change. And so what governments can do, what do we get our governments to do? One is, first of all, do what they can in terms of funding. Now, one part of that funding, and we've seen this here in the United States, is that that funding may be spent domestically. Coming back to the point we're all got the same atmosphere, but as the U.S. is one of the leading carbon producers, cutting the carbon here is important. We still need to provide money internationally. But I think we're going to have to also recognize that governments may be able to get the money out, and that again comes back to this election point, out of their Congresses, out of their parliaments, if it is seen as somehow being domestic and cutting emissions. That's one of the things I think we need to be trying to think about. At the same time, governments have a key role in the MDBs, in the regional development banks. And this comes, I think, at Hiller's point here. Okay, how do we get that money allocated? One of the things is, it's always great to, I've done this, set up a new window at the World Bank, get a new fund here, get a new fund there. Okay, that money may be there, but how does it get out? One thing I would like to suggest is that we try to maybe get some cross-pollination among the windows, among the various facilities in these banks, so that when we're talking about climate change, we're also looking at gender issues. We're also looking at how you build up an SME group, how you get to the people who are lower down in the scale so that they can grow their businesses. One of the points I think too is, and I know with USAID we actually would do this stuff, how do you train people to fill out the blessed forms? Because it isn't just the form they're going to need for the World Bank, it's the form you're going to need for Chase Man, for Morgan, for Goldman Sachs, for whomever it is that's coming up. There are going to be these requirements simply to know what those projects are going to do, what the expected returns are, how that money is going to be spent and over what period of time. That simply is a matter of fact, and we're going to have to deal with it. And I think we can do a better job of helping people deal with that. The other thing I think we need to do is see governments put in place policies and laws and regulations to attract and keep capital for decarbonization. One of the biggest problems we talk about all the time, bringing more capital in, what about the capital that leaves countries? They could be staying at home and undertaking these projects, making the progress that's needed in fighting the carbon thing. How do we get that money to SMEs, to women-led companies, to others? How do we get that to startups? How do we get to that new technology that's a little different, a little questionable? We haven't really thought it, isn't highly proven, but has a potential. That atmosphere of encouraging investment in a country is something crucial for governments. The other thing is that governments need to open and keep open markets. They need to keep open markets for goods and services on the environmental side. I realize right now this is a highly contentious and difficult point because of China and what has sort of been happening there. And I know this is a discussion point between Washington and Beijing, between Brussels and Beijing, between the member states and Beijing, between Tokyo and Beijing, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to be sort of looking to try to keep the markets open, to keep the technologies flowing, to keep the goods flowing. Because if we start blocking things out in protectionism on the environmental front, that's not going to help us either. Finally, governments need to be careful, and I realize this may sound contradictory to what I've just been saying, in terms of picking winners and losers. Governments can take a risk. We've seen this in the United States. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. But they need to be careful in not sort of getting too bought into a particular technology, because it may not be the right one down the pike. But be open to, I think, to that idea of support for investment and support for creativity and support for innovation. But I think there's something else, this is sort of a point that was made earlier, and I think it's a crucial one. We have to look at the same time on the receiving side. What is the condition in the countries in terms of receiving that investment? And these are the things that companies are going to be looking at, as well as governments need to be looking at, and the governments need to address. Those are factors such as corruption, or perceived corruption, misgovernance, default patterns, and finally, and this is an awkward thing to sometimes mention, but every country is in competition with every other company for capital funds. I spent too many years in this department and in other meetings where Minister X comes in and says, please invest in country Y, and a half hour later another minister comes in and says, please invest in country Q. And so when you're sitting on a board, you're looking at these different countries, and you're looking at, well, this is what's happening in Botswana, this is what's happening in Paraguay, this is what's happening in Canada. It might be easier to go with Canada. Well, you know, you have to sort of then figure out how to sort of maneuver in that situation, how to manage that situation so that money does come to Paraguay, it does come to Botswana. At the same time, governments have another key role, something we've not talked about, in an ugly term, market failure. And I would argue we're seeing this right now in terms of the minerals needed for renewables. Right now, lithium, which is a mineral, every time you should read a report about lithium, you'll see how much lithium we need, how many more tons of lithium we need for batteries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, EVs, everything else is lithium battery. You can't get financing for a new lithium mine because there's a glut. There's a glut now, but is there going to be a glut 6 years from now? Oh, and by the way, you don't just open up a mine in 25 minutes. So this kind of thing, same issue exists now with cobalt. How do we, this is something where governments need to be involved in working with the private sector to identify these market failures, figure out which are real, and how to address them. And so I think here too, we need to see governments and private sector have a dialogue on these issues. These discussions have to be fact-based, transparent, unemotional, frank, and if possible, free from theological baggage. Sometimes you're going to have to consider things that don't necessarily sound terribly popular, but that's what we have to be doing. So in sum, in our discussion regarding COP29, I think it's essential not just to be thinking about new funds and facilities, but we need to be not just essential talking about dollars or pounds or yen or whatever currency we're talking about, but we need to be thinking about how those funds are going to be used most effectively, and how we can create the environment to be able to get those funds in where they are needed, and to recognize that some of the headlines might not be what we necessarily want to see going into the COP, but realize what we're really trying to do here is decarbonize. How do we get that money out, and how do we get it to decarbonizing the markets? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Mizuno, I want to bring you into this conversation, and then actually I want to open it up for comments, interventions from others around the table and in the back here. You've been a huge advocate for ESG. You've been the former UN Special Envoy for Climate Finance, as well as the former Chief Investment Officer of the Government Pension Fund of Japan. When we look towards COP29, what do you think could be the best outcome when it comes to financing climate solutions, particularly those led by women? And I stress that because I think all of us around this table and in the room know that women are disproportionately impacted by the climate challenge, but also women bring forth innovative solutions because they are closer to the problem. So please.
Thank you, Alyse, and good morning, everyone. Yes, I used to run the world's largest pension fund where I tried to integrate all the ESG strategies, and also as a UN Special Envoy, I worked on the sustainable finance at the COP26 and 7, which was led by Lord Sharma. And then, so I just wanted to stress 2 points, given the time today. The first one is, I think the COP27 have to set the sense of deadline for the investors and for the capital market. What happened over the last 3-4 years is it's kind of like the stock market is playing something like a chicken game, because the people who don't take action seems to be rewarded better, because they think it's better to wait as long as possible to change their portfolio into the more green economy. So, I also served on the board of Tesla for 3 years, and, there's a debate whether the automaker should go 100% electric or try to stay and keep the internal combustion engine as long as possible. So far, the latter decisions seem to be more rewarding in terms of cash profit. So I think all those kind of things happening because the people, the market don't have a sense of deadline. So, we're talking about all the benchmarks or milestone for 2030, 2035, but that's not what the market believes at the moment. So I think there's a lot of the private sector initiative, which was really promoted by the UK at the COP26, but we just need the government and the policymaker to really set the real sense of deadline. Without that, the capital market and stock market will continue to play chicken game. That's one point. And the second point I like to make is I really want to stress the importance of financing women-led businesses. We pioneered the ESG index investments I was running a pension fund, and out of quite a few different ESG themed indices, after a while, the Women Empowered Index was the best performer. So it is proven that the women-led business seems to be particularly well-serving for these a long-term sustainability agenda, and the performance has been proven. So I think COP26 are like a private sector and a finance corp, and Egypt are developing countries, and Dubai was like more for the natural resource fossil fuel, and Azerbaijan, if they wanted to have like some theme and create a legacy, I think these are working on the women financing women is a good, not bad idea or bad agenda for COP29. So that's what I just wanted to bring up to the discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we probably only have time to take 1 or 2 interventions. I'm going to turn first to Ambassador Milan Verveer.
Thank you, Alyse, and to everybody who made such cogent comments. Obviously, we're dealing with an enormous problem, and COP is going to be struggling with it again, which is to get the kind of financing that is required for a Herculean that is facing all of us, this Herculean problem. But you heard the frustration from Edda, from Hindou, about so many worthy projects that the data undergirds are workable, are necessary, address the most challenging situations in the global south in particular. As Alyse said, it's not that women are disparately impacted, but most importantly, They are the problem solvers. But to solve those problems, they need access to, particularly to renewable technology. And when that takes place, the payoffs are enormous, including in creating enterprises that then result in greater incomes through the economic process. Now, earlier this week at the Clinton Global Initiative, there was a very big discussion on a climate resilience fund for poor women in particular, emanating with a pilot from India that is already has proof of concept, has cases undergirding it. For example, salt workers working in the most extreme temperatures imaginable, 120 degrees, 130 degrees, in that kind of heat, losing income. But through access technology from diesel pumps to renewables, they now are still coping with extreme challenges, but it's transformative in terms of what they're producing for the benefit of the economy that they relate to. And in that room, there were every kind of entity that is needed, the facility to finance, the development banks, the private sector, the technical people, the NGOs, and I think they will get there. They will certainly get the pilot off the ground, but then it's an issue of scaling. And where do we go to get the resources ultimately to prove this can really make a huge difference? And Patricia, I want to ask you, because you have been engaged in this in a long time. You headed up the UNFCCC. There was the Lima program, I think, 10 years ago, at least, that was adopted to begin to move to more gender-responsive climate actions. Where do we go with this? I know there's a mandate, or maybe I shouldn't call it a mandate because it probably there's no way to enforce it, but a recommendation that in the gender action plans of countries that this be integrated. But the bottom line is it's not doing well. And we are far from where we need to be, so we have this huge problem in terms of where do we get the money, and then we have the problem that even with existing money, we hardly get a trickle for these kinds of programs that can have enormous payoffs.
Thank you, Milan, for that question. And also congratulations for the work that you are doing on helping, supporting, especially poor women, those who are really operating in this kind of conditions. I think we need much more of that. I'm very, very encouraged to hear so many comments about how important and how profitable and positive it is to support women financially. Let me say, on your question, where do we go now? I think what I see, what I observe is actually very worrying in terms of the process, because we got initially the Lima work program. We have a call every year, the conference calls on governments to increase the women's participation in their delegations. There is a call also to have more women appointed to the bodies that are part of the climate architecture, and the numbers are not good. Actually, in many cases, we are going back. Numbers are cutting down, and that is not good. If we look at the picture of heads of state and government that we are seeing every year at the conference, I mean, we see something that is not acceptable, that is not representative of the reality of the world in the 21st century. Last year, if I'm not mistaken, it was among more than 100 heads of state, only 7 women. So that's very worrying. Now, we do need, I have to say, yes, what is happening is negotiators go to the COPs, the Conference on Climate Change, and they focus on climate change and adaptation and mitigation. And I would say that there is not yet sufficient attention given to the gender issue. So what happens is that at the end, those who are actually more opposed or don't feel that comfortable with mentioning the gender equality and the gender perspective, the gender lens for different actions, for example, including the gender dimension in national adaptation plans or in the nationally determined contributions, which are the national climate plans, they become then more vocal, but there is no voice that is countering those voices that are not in favor of maintaining and even going further, even going forward on that. So I think we do need to have, invite and really call strongly on governments to include women in their delegations, but also to put an emphasis on this particular issue. I mean, it's not about looking good. It's really about, we're talking about half of their societies, half of their populations, having policies, having actions specifically dedicated for them.
Thank
I
you.
just want to say, for the record, because she's dear to all of us, Tarja Halonen, when she was president of Finland, some 20 years ago, was investing public resources into bringing more women technically, building their capacity technically on these kinds of issues, even before climate change had that pressing connotation that it has today. So if there's will, it can happen, but we are stymied by the traditional problem.
Thank you. I know that we could continue on and on. I've been told we need to end this conversation, sadly, because I know there are many more people who would like to speak. I'm sorry. But thank you so much to our experts, and hopefully this is the beginning of many, many more discussions on this issue, and particularly funding women-led climate solutions. Thank you.